Okay, so I obviously like to pick the most depressing types of subjects. This one is about the Nanjing Massacre. It's called The Girl in the Picture. It's actually a shorter documentary. It's only 40 minutes long. It's done by the USC Shoah Foundation, or at least that's who sponsored the film. For someone who doesn't really know the context overall, there are four alternate names for this incident in history, and two of them are essentially the rape of Nanjing, or the rape of Nanking, because there was a different name for what Nanjing is now at the time. So I believe on maps it was written as Nanking. So you hear it sometimes as the rape of Nanking, or the rape of Nanjing, or the Nanjing Massacre, or the Nanking Massacre. All refer to the same event. 1937, when Japan invaded China and was taking over regions of China. This is pre-World War II. This is the Japan that fought in World War II. This is in a way kind of like a Holocaust-type atrocity event that happened in the city of Nanjing, which is, at the time, was the capital of China. So it's basically describes a massacre, and oftentimes referred to as a rape because there was a lot of killing, but there was also a lot of rape, a lot of mayhem, and a lot of brutality inflicted door to door on people, stabbings, raping, shots to the head, and this story is about a girl who's in a picture. Meaning a picture that a missionary who was there took, where there's these young girls that he found, and he asked for their story, and it's basically they had just been, their entire family, grandparents shot in the head, family members murdered all around, and these two little girls, one of whom was stabbed a bunch of times, but the guard must have thought she was dead. She fainted, but she didn't die. And then a younger sister, 8 years old, and then the younger sister, 4 years old, who hid under blankets and was not even found because she was so small. But this is an event, dark moment in history, significant for a lot of reasons, because it's kind of, in a way, it holds a very an unpleasant past, an unpleasant atrocities of war in history kind of significance, like the Holocaust does, and the concentration camps in Germany and other places.
Yeah, it's really something that's easy to take for granted. I think that's probably why the Shoah Foundation is involved, and people care about it. You have this girl who was 8 when everyone in her family except for one sister survived, and both of them, the soldiers tried to kill by stabbing. And years later, World War II happens, and then after World War II happens, she mentions people aren't even really talking about the rape of Nanking, and she has this miraculous story that she's eventually encouraged to tell. To add on top of that, there's this right-wing Japanese group that at one point tries to discredit her and say she's lying and she has to sue. And it's interesting to think about how you could take something like this for granted, and the fact that, her story was almost completely lost, and she even had to fight to kind of solidify it in history. And I think there's a sense of that, people who are connected to the concept of genocide and like the Holocaust, you have Holocaust deniers, or, people forget, and it's and it's very tragic to think about how many stories are lost in a massacre like this. But I don't know, there's just this kind of feeling of real importance in documenting. I think that's why they made it, is you have this woman who seemed like she was in her 80s or 90s.
Yeah, she's 88.
88, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's this feeling like you have to preserve this history now, and can't lose it, because it's important to remember. Because if you didn't have the evidence of it, it's so atrocious and seems so over the top, you can't even understand, even for war, why someone would be so vicious. It would be hard to believe that it happened.
Yeah, and it's difficult, I think, for people, just in a basic, at least, to believe some of the atrocities without evidence. because maybe from a certain perspective, it's easy to believe that an army is doing normal warlike things, and then all of a sudden a specific troop or even a group decides, you know what we're really going to do? We're going to strike a moral deflation to the enemy. We're going to try to go into their capital and rape a bunch of people and murder whole families. And, you know, that sounds crazy. That sounds like, why would an enemy do that? You know, but in a way, I think a lot of people would think the same thing about concentration camps. Why you're actually taking the Jews and you're sending them off to camps and they're gassing them? Like, is that really happening? If you didn't see it, if there wasn't evidence, I feel like a lot of people's things would be like, what? Why not just focus on the war? What's the point of that? You know, and I think that and also, you know, you might, it's unclear. I actually don't know enough about the history to know if it was a systematic strategy to do what happened on that. It's about a 6-week period where this kind of mass destruction of the old capital of China happened, which is still very much a relevant event as far as some of the resentment that happens, you know, between China and Japan. You know, this thing, they invaded them, but also part of the invasion was so brutal and so senseless that some people were prosecuted after the war for war crimes for what happened. And this footage that was taken was part of that. Part of the prosecution. This father who took the picture of this woman, but also took all this other pictures of, and, you know, just personally attested to what happened in Nanjing during the time. That's, you know, part of why people were prosecuted, but also part of why some of that footage got into American documentaries about what had happened in China. To kind of, they're basically American propaganda films to, you know, get people to go to war, to be into World War II at the time and be like, this is what the Japanese did, like, let's go to war with them. And so this was used for a purpose as well. To see this kind of footage and to think about this, it is important, because you realize that, like, you know, the people who decide that ethnic cleansing is a good thing, or the people who decide that a massive, just disgusting war campaign is an effective thing, are oftentimes not necessarily, have no problem with concealing it as well. You know, and I think that's true. And in reality, I mean, what is it? Freaking Genghis Khan, you know, took over. It created the Mongol Empire on this massive raiding and raping, you know, campaign. In history, this kind of thing has happened before, and has happened and created empires. Empires have been created with this strategy, and so
which is what they were going for.
Which happened to China, you know, during a certain period of its history before this, you know, and other parts of Europe. But
Japan, I believe, at the time had imperialist goal.
Yeah, Japan was on the march. They were taking over land.
They wanted to take over all of Asia and then America next.
Yeah, so there was a goal. There was definitely
or at least maybe that evolved in World War II. I mean, I took a whole class on Japanese history, but
yeah, no, there is an entire set of propaganda films about this from the American perspective at the time. And yeah, Japan, at least elements of it, had their own you know, superiority belief system. And then we're going to do this, we're going to take over Asia, then the United States, then we're going to, you know, then we'll expand our sphere of influence through all the resources that we'll get by taking over the United States. That was an actual theory, at least a believed theory by some people at the time, and they were on that trail. You know, that was part of the whole strategy. But anyway, it is interesting that there's so few pieces of evidence to something so big.
So that's exactly it. I think you would have this, you know, if something so severe happened, wouldn't there be more evidence of it? And it's just surprising for the fact that it did happen. I mean, one missionary deciding to do a lot of work with his camera was like crucial to the point that the United States needed it in like in their trials about it,
Yeah, and you wonder, you go,
in
why?
their hearings about
And
it.
it's hard to look back and go, oh, why did he even have that camera? Like, and it's because he was just given a camera to like take random photos for people to be like, this is what it's like in the capital of China. Like, the missionary who was
Yeah.
taking little quaint videos of what it was like in China pre, World War II. And then all of a sudden he's there when the Japanese are invading this area. And he gets his family out, but he decides to stay to keep trying to help people. And does help them. There's an element of that to this story. It's compelling that a single little girl, an 8-year-old, and a randomly placed priest with a camera in the 30s, are pretty instrumental in telling a story that's very significant in history and still significant to this day to the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese people, at least. I'm not entirely sure how it's handled in Japan, but it is certainly a mark that's important for people to remember and to understand that it happened. And I think also what I was saying is, yeah, there is some context. I mean, the United States, I'm not sure how many people who grew up today know about what's called like the My Lai Massacre or the My Lai Massacre. Have you heard of it? So I
No.
mean, so this is the thing. Like, there's a time in the United States there during the Vietnam War where a couple or a troop or a couple troops of
Oh, I have heard of
yeah,
that.
so a couple troops of U.S. soldiers were raping and massacring villages, and that was suppressed from the American public for, I believe, over a year, if not like a year and a half. And then once it hit, they heard about something in America that had happened a year and a half prior, and then the anti-war movement was just like, oh my god, like, what is going on with it over there? Like, our own boys are being or what's going on? Are they being driven to this? Like, what is happening? This is not the United States, or at least. And so I mean, you see that things can go crazy, and
Mm-hmm.
it can also be suppressed, even in the 70s in the United States. And I'm honestly, I think that this massacre is of a larger scale than the other one I'm describing, but
Mm-hmm.
still, it's really important to know about these things in history, and to know about how fragile the evidence can be, and to not be tempted to believe, to really go out and learn about some of this stuff, just because it is very important for understanding what people have done, can do, and trying to really think hard about not letting that happen if you can, or at least remembering it. And the point of a movie like this is really like, if there's any single point, because it's all not all that long and it's not a whole historical overview, is this whole remember that a couple pieces of evidence might be all that really is there. A couple
Yeah.
stories, a couple people, is oftentimes what really needs to be. It brings something into focus.
Yeah, it really brings to light the importance of documenting something like this and taking in really just what the generation who's about to pass. I mean, we're coming up on that moment where the final people who survived the Holocaust and fought in World War II are alive. And luckily, that's been greatly documented. And I think it is interesting seeing this grandmother show her scars to her, probably 5 or 6 year old grandson,
Yeah,
who,
scars from being bayoneted at 8 years old
yeah,
by these invading Japanese
and,
soldiers.
and he asks her, Grandma, what songs did you sing where you were little? And she was like, well, I didn't really know any songs. We didn't go to school, but we made up melodies and said, the chair has 4 legs or whatever. Just, basically totally unrelatable. And so I think there is something good about almost immunizing yourself by learning this history, because for our generation included, we have our own struggles, but they're, in a way we're soft, or we could totally take for granted how bad things can get if you live in an era where you aren't even exposed to war. And so I think it can be really important, at least for me, I feel personally, to learn about things like this, learn about genocide and the Holocaust, because I think without knowing that they exist, you would be more vulnerable to letting it repeat, which I think is that's kind of the drive behind it. You learn about it kind of in psychology, learning about the Holocaust and some famous experiments, and just this idea of like, do you tell yourself the story that the Japanese are evil, or do you kind of grapple with this difficult truth, which is maybe there's something inside of human nature that's just capable of really evil stuff that's hard to think about.
Yeah, it says something about all people that it is possible under a certain set of circumstances to have really horrible things happen, and you have to be humble enough to just try to not have that happen and not be like, oh, that's just couldn't happen, because it just has so many times. So you're just like, anything more to say on this?
No, it was interesting. I liked it. Short.
Yeah, it's good. It's short. It's called The Girl in the Picture. Hi, everyone. If you want to keep up with us, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on YouTube for the video episodes.